This afternoon, we have John Peter Haywood from Heritage Bank talking about cyber exposure and risk mitigation from a regional bank's perspective and discussing some of the interesting challenges that he's had in a small banking environment, which may or may not surprise some of us. Just a reminder, if your video starts to freeze up, refresh your browser or possibly even restart Chrome. Otherwise, enjoy the afternoon session. Over to you, JP.
Thanks, Heath. Thank you, everybody, for coming along and watching my presentation today. So I'll just make sure that we've got everything good and going here. So I thought I'd just start off with a little bit about who I am, and in case there's people out there that don't really know me or haven't come across me, which is entirely likely. So my name is JP, and I'm the Information Security Manager at Heritage Bank, and I do a lot of things. But some of the things that I've done at my time at the bank, I've built up a new InfoSec team, so I started that from scratch. As part of that, also established the SIEM function for the bank and implemented 24/7 monitoring, so we're watching for stuff around the clock. We also established and designed our SOC, both from a physical, how the room looks and is laid out, which was a bit of fun. We were going through a stage where everybody had facing desks throughout the organisation, and we had to convince our facilities team that we actually needed to be facing the same way to see the screens, but also the processes behind the SOC and the tooling. I was the CPS 234 project lead, so when APRA announced the new piece of compliance was coming out, I was behind the project team to make sure that was all squared away. And I also chair the vulnerability response team, which is reasonably relevant for today's talk. And in my spare time, one of the things I do is I run the Toowoomba chapter of Sec Talks. So just on a side note, if you're looking for somewhere to talk, we'd be more than welcome to have you come and have a chat if anyone's out there. Always looking for speakers. So a little bit about Heritage. So not everybody has come across Heritage, and we've got a long history. We're actually one of the largest customer-owned banks in Australia and one of the longest running in the country. So we have been around for a long time. Way back in 1875, we first started as a building society, and we had a few mergers and things along the way. And we became Heritage Building Society way back in the 80s. In 83, we built the head office building where it is now, downtown Toowoomba. So for those of you who don't know, it's kind of west of Brisbane, out in the countryside on top of the hill. And it's a great little spot, and you get out of the rat race of the city, that's for sure. And in 2011, we became a bank, although we maintain our customer-owned structure, which is quite important and core to some of the philosophies that the bank has. We've won a bunch of awards, so we have the most satisfied customers, and we're also the most authentic bank in Australia as well. And recently, we've become Australia's world best bank, if that makes sense. So the best on the list of world's best banks, we topped it for Australia. So all of this is kind of relevant to what I'm talking about, but kind of give you an idea on where we're coming from as well. So just a little disclaimer before we get too far into the talk. So the views are mine and not necessarily Heritage's, although obviously some of those overlap. And today I'll be talking about a few things, some that we've done and some what we're doing and some what we might do. And some of those things I won't always be clear on which is which. And also, you know, the ideas here that I'm talking about today, they're not all my ideas. I've got a great team and a great network of peers, and you know, we bounce ideas around each other and use other people's ideas and build on them. So I suggest you do the same. I think there's probably some famous person out there that said that you surround yourself by good people, and yeah, if you can do that, then it makes your life a lot easier. And obviously, everyone should think about their own environment, because what works for us might not work for you. So make sure that whatever program you put in place is fit for purpose. Now, I just wanted to cover some definitions at the start. you know, especially if you're new to the field, some of these are often interchanged. So a vulnerability is a weakness that can be exploited by a threat actor in the system. So I've stolen these off Wikipedia, so if you want to look them up, they're down the bottom there. But I just wanted to make a note that vulnerabilities don't always apply just to computer systems. They also apply to other types of systems, people, processes, things like that as well. So keep that in mind. Vulnerability management is the practice of identifying and classifying these, prioritizing them, remediating and mitigating software vulnerabilities. So it's a life cycle of sorts. And vulnerability assessment is part of that life cycle. We're identifying and quantifying and ranking those vulnerabilities against others so that you know how you're going to remediate and mitigate those. And patch management is also part of that life cycle. And it's the part that is responsible for the remediation and mitigation of those vulnerabilities as well. CVSS is another term we'll talk about, and it's basically a scoring system so that you can take vulnerabilities and kind of rank them against each other to get some of that prioritization. There's plenty of, I guess, flaws within that system, but there's probably out of the scope of what we're talking about today. But we will touch a little bit on that. And just to be clear, for the purpose of this talk, I'll be talking about vulnerabilities. And when I say that, I mean restricted to software vulnerabilities. We won't be covering, you know, process or people vulnerabilities. So why do we care about vulnerability management? So I know I've sat through a few talks over the last couple of days that have touched on a few of these things and underscored this. But the global landscape is definitely something that influences vulnerability and why we care about them. So more and more businesses are shifting to a more digital approach, and COVID as well is really driving the behavior for more and more things to be happening online. And we're also seeing an increased number of vulnerabilities being disclosed. So it means there's a much different game than it has been previously. There's also cybercrime that is kind of playing into this as well. So a lot of the time, cyber criminals aren't building 0 days and exploiting things that you've never heard of. A lot of times it's stuff everyone knows about and just hasn't got the patching or hasn't got a solid program that's looking after this stuff. The time from POC or proof of concept to POC, so that's when you get, you know, the vulnerabilities disclosed, there's a proof of concept out and we can see it being exploited. That's shrinking, and you know, it used to be much larger. You know, we're sort of talking weeks or months, and now we're down to hours and days. And there's also trends in ransomware. It's becoming more profitable for ransomware actors. They're making use of these vulnerabilities that people aren't patching to get into networks and deploy their ransomware. We're also seeing them stealing data and things like that. Yeah, it's definitely driving, I guess, motivating people to start taking this a lot more seriously than perhaps they would have before, because they can see that threat is definitely growing. Vulnerability management also has business impact. So if it's done well, you'll actually get decreased downtime, you'll decrease your costs, and you'll maintain that reputation and trust. So at the start, I talked about how Heritage has this long history. We're winning awards for most satisfied customers, you know, most authentic bank, things like that. We have a lot of reputation and trust that we need to look after for our members. It's not just the money, but that's a definitely important thing as well. But it's that trust that those members have in our organisation that we want to maintain. And there's a big part and a core part of our business philosophy. So having a good vulnerability management program to help manage that cyber exposure is not rocket science, but I'm not going to pretend it's easy either. So there's a number of things that play into it, and I'm sure you've seen this before. People, process, and technology. And you have to have all of these things working together to be able to have a successful program. So in terms of people, you have different stakeholders that have different inputs into that program and are also looking at different things. You got people like executive management. They're giving you priority and budget. If you don't have their support, it's going to be hard to get people to come and help you, to get the tools, to get the budget to do the things. You also need vulnerability analysts who are going to help with the vulnerability assessment, work out which of these things is really bad and we need to do something about right now. Which of these things can we kind of wait and look at down the track? You also need system engineers or a patching team, and their roles are kind of varied. One obviously is to make sure that things get patched, but another is to help the vulnerability analysts in understanding some of the exploits and some of the vulnerabilities and provide that SME or the subject matter expert advice to the analysts. So together you'll kind of work towards a good outcome. We also have business and system owners, and oftentimes we forget about these people, and they are important to the process. These are the people that own the application that sits on top of the servers or that business function or that tool, and we really need them to understand the impact of some of their decisions around prioritization, but also we need them to work with us to get things like patching windows that are agreed so that we can patch at certain times, things like that. You need a process, so it makes your life so much easier if the process is documented. Everybody knows where to find it, and they can reference it, they can look at it. You need some clearly defined targets and reporting indicators. So I forget who said this to me, but it was a long time ago, and they said that what gets measured gets managed. So if you measure the wrong things, you're going to get managed the wrong things. So you really need to make sure that the things that you're measuring are the right things, and that is driving the behavior of the process. You need to make sure, like I said before, your patch windows, your scan windows are lined up so that if you have a critical vulnerability, you have a window coming up. Sometimes you might need to do it outside of that, but that month in, month out, you have those windows to get this stuff done. You also need to make sure that you have appropriate test groups, because there's a really quick way to make your business or system owner lose faith, and that is to push out a patch that takes the system offline during a busy time for their use or for their customers. Then they're going to become a little less excited about the work that you're doing next time you need to do something in a hurry. You also need some good sources of vulnerability information, and this can come from a number of places, but you need to kind of get a feel for what's happening in the wider environment. Are these things being exploited right now? What kind of things need to be in place for this exploit to happen or this vulnerability to be taken advantage of? And then that helps you feed in and assess the risk of that vulnerability in a more holistic way. You also need some technology. So without the technology, this would be a very hard process. So you need something that's going to do your vulnerability scanning or your vulnerability assessment. You need something that's going to help you patch the things. And you also need some asset management so that you know what things need patching and what configuration they should be at. So just talking about some of the challenges we face. So like I said, it's not rocket science, but it's not easy. And these are some of the things that we had to try and work through and overcome to improve our vulnerability management program. So our patching targets were out of date. So this is talking about what gets measured. They hadn't moved with industry norms, and they didn't align to our organization's risk appetite. So they definitely needed some change. The vulnerabilities weren't considered in line with our existing controls and other information that we're getting about vulnerabilities. So we're just at that point relying on the raw CVSS score. So if it came out of the box at a 10, that's what we said it was. It was a 10, it's critical. We need to do something without, you know, it might be a vulnerability in SSH, and that server, you know, has a heap of stuff in front of it, IPS and firewalls, etc. You know, maybe it's not critical. It might just be a high, for example. We also had issues where new subnets were being added for new systems, new parts of the network were being built out, and every time the network team created a new subnet, we had to go and manually add that to our scanner. And we were finding that things were getting missed. So we had whole subnets that we weren't even looking at. And, you know, you'd stumble across something, you go, hey, wait a minute. And then all of a sudden you realize that, you know, you've got these holes. We have multiple tools for both our vulnerability scanning and our patch management. So this sort of causes some problems where we couldn't build a solid skill set. We had multiple tools that were telling us different things. We also had a lack of priority in resourcing because we didn't have that executive and business buy-in. No common goal, so the teams were working on what they thought was the best way to work and not all aligned in the same direction. We also have business units that were concerned about downtime and outages. So spoke a little bit about those patch windows. You know, that's one way that you can help address those concerns, but also making sure that you're doing appropriate testing as well. We had some legacy technology that wasn't playing well with our vulnerability scanner, and we also had some new technology that wasn't playing well with our vulnerability scanner. So, you know, we had to come up with some solutions for that. Also, the patching teams were taking the results from the vulnerability scanner and you know, kind of picking them apart and pulling out the false positives and kind of giving off the impression that you know, the vulnerability scanner was inaccurate, and you know, the data we're giving them wasn't sufficient for them to address the risk. We also have things like workstations being turned off overnight. You know, you go home, you turn it off. So we were doing the vulnerability scan after hours to minimize the impact on the network, but everybody was turning their things off after hours. So, you know, we weren't always getting them scanned, and it was when, you know, you'd have people that might leave their workstation on by mistake, you would suddenly get a vulnerability scan and light up like a Christmas tree. We also had a bit of a issue where we were struggling to manage exemptions or risk acceptance and reflecting that in our reporting of our vulnerability management program and things like that, which was taking a lot of time, and we were trying to find a way to streamline that and make our lives a bit easier. So there's a good chunk of stuff there that we needed to fix, and this is kind of how we approached it. So visibility, if you don't know what's out there, then it's very hard to manage it. So we did a few things. We expanded our scan ranges. So instead of having them added manually, we just put these great big scan ranges in, which we're kind of reluctant to do at first because the way that we were scanning meant that the scan was running for a long time. So we changed that, and we ended up building discovery scans. So there's basically, you do a ping scan, you find the things that are up, and then that then builds into another list of when you go off and you do your more in-depth credentialed scan as you go through. Credentialed and agent scanning. So a lot of the time when people are saying that the scanning was inaccurate, we were looking at it and discovering that we weren't actually doing a credentialed scan of that device, and that some of the vulnerabilities it was finding was kind of like a best guess type approach. So by improving and increasing the number of devices that we had credentialed scans for, we certainly reduced those false positives because the scanner was able to get much more insight into what was running on that host. And for our user endpoints, we deployed agents. So what that meant is that instead of all that scanning getting done over the network, it was getting done just locally on the endpoint. And then all that was coming back was basically the results which is just text, and that meant that the overnight scanning problems went away because we were able to do it during the day, and we're getting much better results there. We also expanded the scope of our external and introduced our web app scanning, so we have a much better idea now on what is on our perimeter, which is really important. We tried to simplify where we could, and this is sometimes easier said than done, but if you can reduce complexity, it just makes it easier. It's fairly obvious, I think. So we consolidated our scanning tool set and we chose Tenable. It meant that we had consolidated reporting. It meant we had most skills around Tenable in terms of our vulnerability management platform, and so we were able to consolidate on that and just build our skills out on that one tool set. And we also had a licensing benefit because through economies of scale and things like that, we actually saved money through consolidating our tool set down to Tenable. We also consolidated some of our patching. So we had different things for, I don't know, I think we had 5 or 6 different patching tools at one point. So we reduced that as much as we can. It meant that Linux and Windows server infrastructure could get patched on the same tool, which meant that we're able to take some skills that the Windows team had and transfer them across so that they were able to start patching some of the Linux as well, which meant more people were able to do that, and we were able to turn around that stuff a little bit quicker. We also went through, we reviewed our scanners that we had set up, our reports, the asset groups, dashboards, all that kind of thing. We removed a whole heap of stuff, and we also tightened up the permissions as well. What we're finding is that whilst we had our scans going, the other teams that we're given access to were setting up their own scans and reports, and it was just kind of counterintuitive because they're saying, oh, this thing's showing me this and that, and it's like, well, what are you looking at? It's not what I'm seeing over here. So that really helped us out to simplify that approach. We also came up with a clear plan so that everybody knew what we were executing against, and I think that's really important that everyone's on the same page, top to bottom, executives right down. We all know where we're going. Given the level of detail might change between those levels, it all kind of rolls up into one. So that kind of comes to focus, and it's given us that focus. So everyone's going in the same direction. We were able to get new targets agreed to, and we had support from executives and senior management for that. We now have our targets aligned to industry norms that matches our risk appetite. So, everybody, it's all tightened up and we know where we're going. We set up a vulnerability response team. So this is a cross-functional team that manages and responds to vulnerabilities. So anything critical we talk about and we get patched right away. And then we also look at ways that we can, make improvements to the vulnerability management process, but also make sure that nothing gets missed along the way. So if the current patching cycles don't pick something up, we'll pick it up and address that through that forum. And like I said, cross-functional. So we've got developers, infrastructure network, security guys, all working towards the same goal. We started using a more risk-based lens in assessing vulnerabilities. So one of the goals that I wanted is that if I went to one of the patching teams and said this is critical, it really was critical, and it's like we need to patch this or we're in trouble. And the number of vulnerabilities that were critical based just off CVSS, weren't really what I thought, taking into account our internal infrastructure and the controls that we had in place. But also we'd find some that may be a high or a medium in CVSS, and you look at that and you go, we need to bump that up and do something about that much sooner. Part of that was considering, is it under active exploit? How long has it been around for? Are there tool sets which help deploy this easily? Tenable has a VPR score that we've started to use that takes into account some of these things. But we also do our own, I guess you call it like threat research or something, and we take in from external sources for a daily threat briefing around what we're seeing in the outside world, and if anything pops up there, to make sure that we're onto it. We also developed some tools. So one of those was to use an API to manage those exemptions. So instead of an analyst sitting down and clicking, we're able to programmatically execute that in a much shorter period of time, which shrunk the amount of time it took to manage those risk acceptances month on month. And it was a really good example of how we worked with the development team to help us build that, so that we could get it done in a much shorter period of time. And yeah, that was a really good outcome for us. We've also started logging data from Tenable into Splunk. So we built an app to help recast and assess those risks into Splunk, which that saved us a heap of time as well. And it kind of took it from this massive task that we had no idea on how we were going to do to something that we can just do day in, day out. As the vulnerabilities pop up, we can go through, we can run them through this tool, put our kind of local knowledge across it, and we can get those risks, the CVS scores going up and down based on how our environment looks. We've also used it to build out some other interesting alerts and searches for things. There's some good stuff that we've done there. Some of the things I'm just trying to think, looking for software that you might not know is in your network and things like that. And it's just one example. We also spent a bit of time working on business and system owner engagement. So making sure that we get agreed patch windows and outages. So our service delivery team has done a great job here. So it's not only windows for patching, but also for system upgrades and things like that, where they need to do maintenance outside of vulnerability management. We're seeing that business is starting to own the vulnerability risk. So it's not just the security guys that are saying, hey, we need to patch this stuff. They're taking an interest. They're starting to own that risk and drive those outcomes. We've also worked to get vulnerability management considerations into the deployment of new systems and servers and networks. So we're having issues where you have an application that was built on a version of Java, but then you have to run that version of Java for the rest of your life because that application needs to work. So we spend a lot of time looking at things like that, and how can we avoid getting ourselves in this position where we're tied to this vulnerable version of code. And happily, we've managed to work through that list of things and find solutions for each of those applications so that we can update those components. We're also looking at, if this thing is really important, we need to make sure that we are able to patch it. And if it needs to be something that needs to be tested, how do we do that? How do we make sure that we can test it before it goes back into production? Looking at things like HA or high availability, and not just from like a DRBCP perspective, but it's really great if we could do it so that we can patch things during the middle of the day, because it means that then our system engineers and desktop engineers aren't having to stay up all night to do patching. They can just schedule that automation to go off and do that in the middle of the day, and we've got hands on deck that if there is any problems, we can quickly address it and fix it. Ownership is another one. So making sure that everybody knows what their responsibilities are, what they should be doing, when they should be doing it, and reviewing the output on a regular basis. So after all of that, did we get some results? Well, yes, they improved, which was the main outcome. We got efficiency gains within the security team. So by building those apps to use the APIs and in Splunk, we're able to shorten that vulnerability assessment process just by heaps. We also have this cross-functional team now, so the vulnerability response team that's actively working on improving vulnerability management, working together, and we're seeing where peers are helping each other across different teams to solve problems that they see coming up. So, you know, our patching teams aren't siloed in their specialities anymore, and if they're getting any issues, they can bring them to the table and discuss, and we can find a way forward as a group. We also have executive and management support. So, you know, that's really important when you're, you know, trying to get time from developers and infrastructure engineers that are on projects and things like that to help out. We've reduced our licensing costs, like I said before, which is always good if you can say that, you know, here's some firm evidence that we've managed to reduce some money. And we also have improved accuracy. So through increasing our credential scans, having those agents on the endpoint, it means that we've increased our accuracy, so we're getting less, you know, false positive complaints. Now, there's always going to be some. It's never going to be perfect. It's just the way the world is. And we've also increased our visibility as well. So much more confident that we're seeing the things that we need to see, and then we're not missing anything. Our new systems are being better deployed so that we're able to manage vulnerabilities a lot easier because of the way that we're deploying the systems. We've also done things like use Tenable to search for IOCs. So because it's running across our endpoints, you know, you can load up audit files and queries, and you can look for certain strings and things like that quite easily, and you can use that data in Splunk to search retrospectively as well if you're looking for indicators. So what's next? Well, like I said, we're always looking at ways to improve. So we're working on dependencies. So dependencies are a bit harder than just normal vulnerabilities, I suppose, in a sense. And you know, more and more parts of our business are starting to use, you know, automation, data science, and things like that to try and improve efficiency and outcomes for their specific use case. So trying to keep a handle on that. We're looking at scanning containers so that we're pulling out the dependencies within that container and making sure that they're nice and solid, and trying to do that within the pipeline. You know, our current pipeline, the security tests run along. We've got security gates there. So the devs are fixing it before it gets to a point where it's even close to production, which is really good. We're also, you know, integration into current reporting. So I'm quite keen around that, because when we had those disparate systems that weren't talking to each other, we used to spend a lot of time from a little bit of data here, a little bit of data there, and trying to put it together. So we really need that integration so that we've got that single pane that everybody's looking at. So we're looking at SOAR as a way to help manage vulnerabilities as well. So we already have integration from Tenable to our SOAR platform, or vice versa. And we're using that during incident response, so we can get up-to-date information of what vulnerabilities are on that system, you know, the kind of patch status, and we can perform ad hoc scans and things like that, which is enriching the data that we have already for the analysts, which is really great. And we're looking at how we can build as much of our vulnerability management process into our SOAR platform. So whether some of the manual stuff that we're still doing, we can automate into our automation platform to, you know, make it even easier. It just kind of happens. You know, using our asset data to do some of that assessment automatically, so that trying to get some of that inherent knowledge out of our brains and into a tool to help flesh out and really highlight anything that really is critical. And also, you know, automate the ticket creation for the patching teams, so we can kind of set some parameters We can go off and automate, activities that we're doing manually at the moment, and then have that automatically pushed through into the queues for the patching teams. We've also got improving our audit files and baseline scans. This is around compliance scanning. So if you're building stuff solid at the start, it's much easier to manage as you go, because there's not so many places that vulnerabilities can creep in if you start with that solid base. And we're writing plugins and audit files to go looking for things that are specific to our environment that we care about. Which kind of covers that point. And also, we're looking at ways that we can improve our reporting. So reducing, I guess, the different types of reporting, and making sure that it all aligns, and that, whilst you need the detail, this hosts this vulnerability, here's how you remediate it for our patching teams. You need that all to roll up with the same lens for our executive teams. And then, that just helps in the management of things. What gets measured gets managed. So if you're measuring the right things and it's all rolling up, then that's what is going to get managed too. So that's really important. So I've made this kind of ugly process diagram here. So sorry about the patchiness of it, I suppose. But I thought it might be useful to put out in sort of a picture form how we look at our process. So internally, we have our discovery scan, which then feeds a list of discovered assets, which we do the credential scans against. And we have that same process externally as well. This makes the scan times much faster, which means that we can scan more often, which is really good. We also have agent scanning, web app scanning, container scanning, ad hoc scans, and our audit compliance scans. So they all of these scans feed into an assessment and enrichment process, I suppose you call it. So we use a number of tool sets there, so Tenable, Splunk, our threat intel, patching teams, security automation, outputs around our accepted risks and things like that. And that all gets munched together and then starts spitting out into reports. And the reports are, board, risk committee, security committee, patching teams, and off we go. So, we just kind of loop around that process. So just some final thoughts. How can you be a hero? So build the process. So if you've got a solid process that everyone can follow, make it as simple as possible. Have some clear goals. So make sure that they're appropriate. You've got your stakeholders engaged across all levels. They know why they're doing things, how they're doing things, and when they're doing things. Make sure that you've got discipline and accountability. So discipline is a big one, doing the same things over and over and over again. Repeatable actions, and hold yourself to account as well as the stakeholders. And most importantly is the communication piece that wraps all of this together and kind of greases the wheels and makes it all work. So it brings us to the end. So if anyone's got questions, if they want to pop them in the Q&A, I'll pop that screen up and I can answer those.
Wow. Bingo. The hardware mute button does me in every time. Sorry, so
Right.
we're basically out of time, but there's 4 questions in the Q&A. If you wanted to try and very quickly address those.
Yeah, no worries. So patch management deployment tool. So we still have a couple that we're using, but we have shrunk it down. So we're using BigFix and sorry to whoever makes this, but Shavlik, whatever they're called now. I keep forgetting their new name. So BigFix we're using for our endpoints, our user devices, and then the new Shavlik. I'm not on the team that has to play with it every day, so you can tell that I've forgotten.
They're one of the ones that was consumed by Avanti.
Yeah, there you go. That's it. So yeah, they're our main ones. How big is my team, and do I have any difficulty attracting qualified people? So currently, I got 6 on my team. really huge, and it keeps us pretty busy. But using things like like some of the automation and things like that is we were really looking to kind of leverage what we're doing there as well. In terms of attracting qualified people, well, yeah, we are a ways out of the big cities. Not too far, it's only an hour and a half to Brisbane. But I think COVID's going to shake that up a lot. I have been asked a number of times whether we'd consider hiring in Brisbane or other places, and at that time I just hadn't the time to put my brain around how to manage a remote team and how it would look like for the SOC. But hey, we've done that now, so it's going to make life a bit easier for us. But up until now, we've kind of taken the approach where we look for potential, and we take that potential and we try and foster that. And we've had, I think, a lot of success with that, looking for potential and good fit for team, and then building those skills. So Mark's got a question there around Tenable.io. We are using Tenable.io, but we're also using Tenable Security Center as well, and the Nessus agent. So they were kind of tying together, and different parts of it for different use cases. So Tenable.io definitely we're using across the perimeter, whereas Security Center we're running internally more to give those deeper insights into the internal network.
I think we're going to have to stop it there, JP. If you want to try and answer the rest of those questions in the general chat, I'm sure everybody would appreciate it. Thank you. Really interesting to actually hear what's going on in a regional banking environment and to see how things are actually traveling. I imagine you might be more willing to hire remote people now after the change with COVID.
Yeah, who knows?
You never know.
It's definitely an opportunity.
Okay, we're going to take a quick 2-minute break, and then we'll have Simon Starn after that break talking about the real heroes of our environments and information, those being governance and architecture.
All right, thanks.